My boss fired me for being too expensive. After 18 years leading engineering, his panic calls. We can get 3 junior engineers for your salary, he smirked during my termination meeting. Nothing personal, just cost cutting. My name is Victor Hale, 55 years old, lead systems engineer at Veltria Housing for 18 years. I'd built their entire infrastructure from scratch, architected every expansion, kept everything running so smoothly that the executives forgot how much the company depended on me until they decided they couldn't afford me anymore. I sat across from Graham Vickers, the new chief technology officer who'd been with the company for all of 6 months. He was 42, wore designer glasses, and had an MBA from Cornell. He'd been brought in to modernize operations, which apparently meant cutting the most experienced staff first. The HR representative slid a folder across the table with my severance package. 2 months' salary plus accrued vacation time. I nodded, took the folder and asked if that was all they had to say. Graham looked almost disappointed. Perhaps he'd expected me to argue or threaten legal action, give him something to tell the board about how difficult I was being. I simply shrugged when he mentioned most people in my position have questions or concerns. It seemed straightforward enough to me. What they didn't understand was that I wasn't calm, I was just done. There's a difference. Graham mentioned they'd appreciate my help with the transition, suggesting a consulting arrangement for a few weeks, as the new engineering team would need guidance on the system architecture. I told him I'd think about it, knowing I wouldn't. We shook hands. I cleared out my desk without complaint. 18 years of work fit into a single cardboard box. I nodded goodbye to a few colleagues who looked away awkwardly, afraid the same fate awaited them. As I walked to my truck in the parking garage, my phone buzzed with a text from Alan, the database administrator I'd hired 12 years ago, saying the whole team was freaking out. I didn't respond. At home, I sat on my deck overlooking Lake Ontario, nursing a glass of bourbon, watching the sunset paint the water copper. My wife Elaine placed a hand on my shoulder, asking what I would do now. I shrugged and said something would turn up. What Graham didn't know, what he hadn't bothered to learn, was that I hadn't just built their systems. I had custom-coded large sections myself with minimal documentation, because the company had always refused to fund a proper documentation team. Only I understood the deep redundancies, the hidden security layers, the intricate network architecture, and I wasn't planning to explain it to anyone. I started at Veltria Housing back when it was called Bayview Properties, a small real estate management firm with 4 apartment complexes and a dozen employees. Their entire IT infrastructure consisted of 2 desktop computers, a fax machine, and a dial-up internet connection. The owner, Harold Bay, hired me away from a consulting gig in Syracuse, saying they were expanding and needed someone who could build something solid. Over 18 years, I'd turned that rudimentary setup into an integrated property management system that handled everything from tenant applications and background checks to automated maintenance requests and rent collection across 63 properties in 4 states. I'd built it piece by piece, adapting, upgrading, refining as the company grew. When Harold retired 5 years ago, his son Justin sold the company to a private equity firm that rebranded it as Veltria Housing. They kept me on, impressed by what I'd built. But things began to change. New executives, new priorities. Quarterly targets became more important than long-term stability. The warning signs came gradually. First, they rejected my proposal for a documentation team. Too expensive, they said, promising to revisit it next quarter. That quarter never came. Then they started bringing in consultants, young MBA types who talked about disrupting property management and leveraging cloud solutions. They'd sit through my explanations of our system architecture with glazed eyes, then recommend off-the-shelf solutions that wouldn't integrate with our custom infrastructure. I kept pushing back, explaining why their approach wouldn't work, showing them the custom code that made our system unique. Eventually, they stopped inviting me to planning meetings. My wife noticed it before I did. Over dinner one night, she warned me they were pushing me out and I needed to prepare. I brushed her off, insisting they needed me since no one else understood how the whole system worked together. That might be exactly the problem, she replied. 6 months ago, they hired Graham as the new CTO. He came from a banking software company and immediately started talking about standardization and legacy system replacement. He hired 3 junior engineers fresh out of college and had them shadowing me, asking questions about the system. I answered their questions, but I knew they weren't grasping the complexities. How could they? It had taken me years to build those systems, to understand the interdependencies, to create the redundancies that kept everything running smoothly when problems arose. Last week, Graham stopped by my office for a quick meeting tomorrow morning. Just a quarterly check-in, he said casually. I should have seen it coming. The first call came 2 weeks after my termination. I was in my home office updating my resume when Graham's name appeared on my phone. I let it go to voicemail. His message mentioned issues with the tenant portal, with the junior team having trouble understanding my code architecture, requesting a quick consultation. I deleted the message and went back to my resume. 3 more calls came that day, each voicemail sounding increasingly desperate. By evening, Alan texted that systems had been down all day, maintenance requests weren't processing, and Graham was losing his mind. The next morning, HR called about a generous consulting arrangement to help with current system issues, $300 per hour, minimum 4-hour engagement. I told them I'd think about it, and hung up. I sat at my kitchen table, staring out at the lake as Elaine placed coffee in front of me. "What are you thinking?" she asked. I was thinking they were finding out exactly what I was worth. Over the next 3 days, the calls increased. Graham, HR, even Justin Bay, who was still on the board. The tenant portal was down. The maintenance scheduling system was throwing errors. The automatic payment processing had failed, affecting thousands of residents. I didn't respond to any of them. On day 4, an email arrived from Devlin Systems, a regional competitor to Veltria. They managed fewer properties, but had been expanding rapidly. The email came from their director of technology, Lawrence Devlin himself, saying they'd always admired my work and wanted to discuss opportunities as they were looking to upgrade their entire property management infrastructure. I replied and set up a meeting for the following day. That evening, as Elaine and I prepared dinner, my doorbell rang. Graham Vickers stood on my porch, his designer glasses slightly askew, his normally immaculate suit wrinkled. He apologized for dropping by unannounced, but described their emergency situation. The entire system was down, nothing was working, and the team couldn't figure out what was wrong or how to fix it. He mentioned the board had authorized a substantial consulting fee of $500 per hour, whatever it took. I thought about the cardboard box in my garage. 18 years of work reduced to a few mementos. I thought about nothing personal, just cost cutting. I thought about the documentation team they'd never approved. I quietly expressed sympathy for their troubles, but mentioned I had an interview tomorrow. Something would turn up, just like I thought. I closed the door on his stunned face and went back to making dinner. For the first time since my termination, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. Not satisfaction, not vindication, just clarity. I wasn't going to help them fix what they'd broken. The interview with Lawrence Devlin went better than expected. Meeting at a coffee shop in downtown Rochester, he mentioned following my work for years, calling the integrated property management system I built at Veltria legendary in our industry. He explained they wanted to build something similar, but didn't want to start from scratch. They needed someone who understood the architecture, integration points, and security layers. Someone who could build something better than what existed. When I expressed interest, Lawrence offered me the position of Chief Systems Architect, with full benefits, stock options, and a salary 20% higher than what I'd made at Veltria. It seemed too good, prompting me to ask why they'd choose me over younger, cheaper engineers. He laughed, saying they'd tried that route, hiring bright young engineers from top schools who built something sleek and modern that crashed with more than 100 simultaneous users. "We don't need cheap, we need reliable," he said. I accepted the offer the next day. Meanwhile, Veltria's problems were escalating. Alan kept me updated through occasional texts. The system had been partially restored, but critical functions were still failing. They'd brought in an expensive consulting firm specializing in legacy system recovery. A week after starting at Devlin, Graham called again, explaining they'd lost access to payment records for the past 3 months, with tenants complaining about incorrect charges. The consulting team needed my input on the database structure. I was tempted to ignore it, but something made me pick up. I explained I was employed elsewhere now, with an exclusive contract and couldn't help. When he offered to double whatever Devlin was paying me for just 2 days of my time, I clarified it wasn't about the money. He asked if it was about revenge, if I was enjoying watching them struggle. I paused, considering my answer carefully. No, I wasn't enjoying it, but they'd made a business decision, deciding my experience wasn't worth the cost. Now they were discovering what that actually meant. Graham mentioned the board wanted to discuss bringing me back, full salary plus a signing bonus. For a moment I felt a flicker of satisfaction, but it quickly faded. Going back would solve nothing. The same executives who decided I was expendable would be waiting for the next opportunity to cut costs. I appreciated the offer, but explained I'd made a commitment to Devlin's systems. His voice hardened, suggesting there could be legal implications if they discovered I intentionally made their systems difficult to maintain. Non-compete clauses, intellectual property concerns. There it was, the threat I'd been expecting. I replied evenly that the system was exactly as it had been when the company repeatedly denied my requests for a documentation team. Every line of code belonged to Veltria, as specified in my employment contract. I'd taken nothing except my experience. I invited him to have his lawyers contact mine, and hung up, hands shaking slightly, not from fear but from anger. I hadn't allowed myself to feel until now. The accusation that I'd somehow sabotaged them was the final insult. At Devlin I was starting fresh, building systems properly from the ground up with full documentation, training programs for the engineering team, and redundancies that would prevent the kind of catastrophe Veltria was experiencing. I wasn't going to look back anymore, but I wasn't going to help them either. Some lessons had to be learned the hard way. A month after joining Devlin's systems, an unexpected visitor appeared in my new office. Alan, my former database administrator, stood awkwardly in the doorway, holding a laptop bag, asking if I had time for lunch. Over sandwiches at a nearby deli, he filled me in on the chaos at Veltria. Worse than I thought. They'd lost access to historical data going back 3 years. The backup systems were somehow corrupted, and the consulting firm suggested they might need to rebuild from scratch. I wasn't surprised. The backup system had multiple redundancies and security protocols that needed to be followed precisely. Skip one step, and the entire process would fail in a way designed to protect tenant data from unauthorized access. Alan continued, revealing something he'd found while helping consultants understand the payment processing system. Graham had been planning my termination for months, meeting with the board to convince them my custom infrastructure was too expensive to maintain. He showed me a series of emails discovered in the system archives between Graham and the board discussing the legacy staff reduction plan, specifically naming me as the first target. Graham told them they could replace me with cheaper engineers and transition to off-the-shelf solutions within 6 months, projecting cost savings of over $1 million annually. Reading through the emails, I felt strangely detached. One line from Graham stood out. Hale's custom systems are unnecessarily complex. He's made himself indispensable by design, not necessity. Alan revealed more. The private equity firm owning Veltria was planning to sell, prepping for over a year. Graham was brought in specifically to cut costs and make the company look more profitable before the sale. It all made sense now. The push for standardization, resistance to proper documentation, sudden focus on reducing senior staff costs. It wasn't about improving the company, but dressing it up for a quick flip. When I asked why he was showing me this, Alan explained he'd quit yesterday, and wasn't alone. Half the IT department had left. The consultants estimated at least 6 months to restore full functionality, maybe longer. He hesitated before adding that Veltria's biggest client, Westbrook Properties, was considering jumping ship after losing faith in the management system. I considered the implications. Westbrook represented nearly 30% of Veltria's revenue. Losing them would be devastating, especially with a sale pending. Alan revealed he was hoping Devlin might be hiring database administrators. Later that afternoon, I spoke with Lawrence about bringing Alan on board. He agreed immediately. We were building a team brick by brick with people who understood what it meant to create systems that lasted. That evening, I received another call from Graham. This time, his voice had lost its authoritative edge. He pleaded that the situation was critical. Westbrook threatening to terminate their contract. The board questioning his decisions. He begged for help, offering to name my price. I apologized, but explained I couldn't help him. When he insisted I name my price, I clarified it wasn't about price, but about respect for experience, for the work that goes into building something right the first time. After a moment of silence, he accused me of knowing this would happen, exactly what would break and when. I denied it, explaining I just knew what I had built and what it took to maintain it, information I had tried to share many times. I ended the call feeling neither triumph nor regret, just the quiet certainty that some lessons can only be learned through failure. The opportunity came faster than expected. 2 months into my role at Devlin Systems, Lawrence called me into his office. He'd just spoken with Jeffrey Westbrook Properties. They were officially terminating their contract with Veltria next month and wanted to know if we could handle their portfolio. Over 10,000 units across the Northeast, more than doubling Devlin's current operations. I admitted we weren't ready for that scale. The new system was coming along but only halfway there. Lawrence asked what it would take to get ready. I considered it carefully. 3 more senior engineers, dedicated server infrastructure, and at least 8 weeks of development time. Even then, it would be tight. Lawrence explained Jeffrey was desperate. Veltria's failures were affecting their reputation with tenants. He was willing to give us 12 weeks and fund the infrastructure expansion. This was the turning point. If Devlin took on Westbrook and succeeded, it would establish us as a serious competitor. If we failed, it could sink both companies. I promised to develop a plan by the next day. That night, I barely slept, sketching system diagrams, mapping data migration pathways, considering scaling challenges. By morning I had an ambitious but achievable plan, a hybrid approach to onboard Westbrook's properties in stages, minimizing disruption. Lawrence studied my plan carefully, noting I'd included a substantial documentation phase, adding 3 weeks to the timeline. I insisted it was non-negotiable. That's where Veltria failed. We would document everything from day one, train the team on every component. No single points of failure. Lawrence agreed, and we moved forward. The next weeks were intense. We hired 5 more engineers, including 2 who recently left Veltria. Alan built a database migration tool to translate Veltria's data structure into our new system. I designed a modular architecture that could scale with Westbrook's needs. Halfway through the project, I received an email from Justin Bay, the former owner's son who still sat on Veltria's board. He apologized for how things ended, admitting the board was misled about the implications of letting me go. Graham had been removed as CTO. They were struggling to recover, and Westbrook's departure would hit them hard. If I was ever interested in coming back, the door was open. I didn't respond. 10 weeks into our 12-week timeline, we were ready for a staged rollout. Westbrook's smallest region, 2,000 units in western New York, would migrate first. If successful, the remaining regions would follow. The day before migration, Lawrence called me into his office. Jeffrey Westbrook himself was waiting, curious to meet the system architect. Lawrence had told him so much about . Jeffrey mentioned he'd heard I used to work for Veltria. He explained they were in trouble, the private equity firm trying to sell. But with Westbrook leaving, and their system still not fully functional,
They weren't finding many interested buyers. Except one, Devlin Systems. Lawrence confirmed they were considering making an offer at a substantial discount to Veltria's valuation from 6 months ago. If that happened, they'd want someone who understood both companies to lead the integration, salvaging valuable elements from Veltria's infrastructure, while transitioning everything to the new architecture. I agreed to work on the integration if the acquisition went through, with one condition: we would do it right. Full documentation, proper training, no shortcuts. Lawrence agreed, saying they'd learned that lesson. 6 months later, I stood in the lobby of what had once been Veltria Housing's headquarters. The sign now read, Devlin Integrated Property Management. The acquisition had gone through for less than a quarter of what the company had been valued at before my departure. Lawrence and I walked through the office greeting former Veltria employees who would stay through the transition. Some looked away awkwardly. Others smiled with relief. A few who had worked closely with me over the years nodded with quiet understanding. Graham was gone, along with most of the executive team that had approved my termination. Justin Bay had stayed on as a consultant, helping ease the transition with legacy clients. When we reached the server room, my old domain, I paused. Through the glass, I could see the hardware I'd specified, the blinking lights of systems I'd designed. Lawrence asked if I wanted to go in. I declined. We'd be migrating everything to the new infrastructure anyway. In the main conference room, Lawrence introduced me to the remaining Veltria staff as the Chief Integration Officer, who would oversee the technical transition. As I looked at the faces, some familiar, some new, I felt no triumph, no desire to say I told you so. Instead, I briefly explained the transition plan, timeline, and support available to everyone during the process, emphasizing that no one would be left behind due to cost-cutting measures. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. 1 year after the acquisition, Devlin Integrated Property Management had become the largest property management company in the Northeast. The migration was complete, with all properties running on the new system I designed, fully documented, properly staffed, and functioning smoothly. On a crisp autumn morning, I drove to the office for a final meeting with Lawrence. The leaves along Lake Ontario had turned brilliant shades of red and gold, a fitting backdrop for the conclusion of this chapter. Lawrence informed me the board had approved my proposal. The Technical Education Division would launch next quarter, with full autonomy for me to design the curriculum and hire instructors. This had been my condition for staying after the integration, not a higher title or more money, but creating a division dedicated to training the next generation of systems engineers and architects, teaching them not just how to code, but how to build things meant to last. Lawrence expressed gratitude for what I'd built, not just the technology, but the culture around it, the documentation, knowledge sharing, and emphasis on quality over quick fixes. Later that afternoon, as I cleared out my integration office, a planned transition to my new role, unlike my hasty exit from Veltria, Justin Bay knocked on my door, asking for a minute. We walked to the small courtyard outside the building. He mentioned his father had asked about me. Retired in Florida, but still following company news, Harold was glad to hear I was back. In a manner of speaking, Justin shared that his father always said letting me go would be the biggest mistake the company could make. Turns out he was right. Justin reflected that he'd learned something from all this. Value isn't always visible until it's gone. Driving home along the lake shore, I thought about value of experience, of care taken, of doing things right the first time, about systems built to last, and the people who build them. I hadn't sought revenge. I hadn't needed to. I'd simply moved forward, building something better, something that would outlast any individual decision or short-term thinking. Sometimes the best response to being undervalued is simply to prove your worth elsewhere and let the results speak for themselves.